ready to go.
Okay, thank you, Christine. I'm Kathleen Lynch, Executive Director of the Folger Institute, and it is my great pleasure to be with you, welcoming you, thanking you, and special thanks to our organizers, among whom I count my colleague Owen Williams. Owen and Christine have been at this faithfully. They have not given up hope. This was supposed to happen a while ago.
Yes.
Carolyn came on board. She did not abandon ship. It is really remarkable, a remarkable example of people keeping at a good idea and taking the challenges and the bumps in the road as opportunities to keep thinking, keep improving. The creativity that I see with the collection of artifacts of intangible cultural inheritance, I think is fabulous. I have worn my mother's seat metal relic in honor of that dimension of this, and all the partnerships that you're doing are so important. I also want to say thank you to West Virginia University for 50 years of membership in the Folger Institute Consortium. West Virginia University was the very first university that joined the consortium outside of Washington, D.C. We were just 1 year into our grand adventure when some of your predecessors were inspired to say, this makes sense for us to be part of this partnership. And the thing that's so wonderful about the consortium is the levels of partnership at the administrative university level, faculty planning, graduate students benefiting from all of the programs. And West Virginia, again, has been an incredibly loyal partner. And even more importantly, when we got to this new opportunity from the closing of our building for major renovation, West Virginia University is one of the universities that stepped up with a great idea to host a consortium-funded program. And again, back to the pursuing the great idea and continuing to make it even better, it seemed like a lovely idea for West Virginia University to think about heritage from the perspective of West Virginia and Appalachia. But as these couple of years have gone by and the challenges that we're facing as a society, understanding our own heritage and being able to look at heritage honestly and collectively, this became not just a program with significance for this region, though it's really important that the perspective comes from this region, but it's a program that we all have to pay attention to. So I'm just really honored again to be here on behalf of my colleagues, and I will stop taking up your time because I know you've got a great program to go, and nice to meet some of you and nice to see some old friends. Okay, thanks.
I can't decide whether I should, Max. I'm going to take it off from my remarks. Thank you, Kathleen. And unlike you, off the cuff, eloquent, I'm going to read some notes. It says here, I'm Carolyn Dinshaw. I am really happy to be here to join Kathleen and Christine in welcoming you in person to Historicizing Heritage. So this isn't your usual conference gathering. I hasten to admit that I don't know what that is anymore. Now that COVID has upended the culture of conference going with all of its familiar rituals, the pinning on the name tags, the coffee breaks, the awkward elevator rides. What the future holds as far as conference going is concerned. It's an open question. Maybe more gatherings in hybrid modalities like what we're trying here. But what makes this gathering unusual, in my experience, is not only its pandemic inflected format, but more important, the exploratory environment that we're trying to cultivate here. We sought out an eclectic mix of thinkers and writers with relationships to many disciplines, from a range of ranks and locations in the university or in the academy to several working outside the academy, and that now includes me. We all have some interest in relating the past to the present, understanding both past and present to be complex and not by any means mutually exclusive. And we're gathering in a place, as Kathleen said, of powerful and enduring heritage discourses, starting with that persistent, albeit long disproven genealogy of the Appalachian dialect as somehow premodern or early modern, closer to Chaucer or Shakespeare than other American dialects. I will mention as a side note that a number of our invited participants responded to our initial invitation with stories of their own relationship to the region, their own Appalachian heritages. And I look forward to hearing more about those across the weekend. Our title, Historicizing Heritage, brings together concepts from institutionally separated disciplines. The canonical practices of historical and literary historical study in our title meet the study of folklore, which has much less of a foothold in the academy these days. In the US and the UK academy, the discipline of folklore studies has since the 1930s been subjugated to history, to literature, to archaeology and anthropology. Folklore practitioners were thought to be dilettantes without scientific training. Many departments closed, the field itself attenuated and is endangered. I'm always interested in what the academy throws by the wayside. And in this case, with the current rise of public humanities in the face of diminishing the diminution of academic humanities, those previously dismissed folklore practices, I think, are making a kind of indirect comeback. So that's something we can think about together. And we want to see what can be done, imagined, created, discussed, when these two ways of thinking about the past and making relations to it come into contact. Heritage is, in fact, riven with paradox, as Valdemar Hoffmann shows in his chapter, Making Heritage, which is part of the workshop readings, in case you had a chance to look at it. Preservation is really about change. What we take from the past is really about the future. The construction and celebration of what binds us together as a people hides dangerous fault lines and dissension. You know, we asked our speakers to bring with them an artifact of intangible cultural heritage, not necessarily about Appalachia, perhaps from their own research, perhaps not, but something that is, quote, an object, instrument, or craft, a word, ritual, place, practice, or a thought that helps us imagine and work with the concept of heritage. So I want to turn to mine now, my artifact. Not to be a total downer at the outset of our time together, but my artifact references the horrible event in Uvalde, Texas on Tuesday. To be honest, this is what totally overtook my brain as I tried to turn yesterday to final preparations for our convening, because the news is so horrible, and particularly because my sister has family in Uvalde, and 3 of their little girls were killed. So I'm bringing my artifact of intangible cultural heritage today. A heritage that is not to be celebrated, but is rather soaked in tears. My artifact is gun violence. It's one thing that makes us unique as Americans. Unlike almost any other place in the world, we gun each other down regularly, every day, probably every hour. Indeed, what you call it is very important to how this heritage is understood. Hoffmann makes this point very clearly. Heritage is a productive concept. It produces nations, it produces cultures, it produces communities. I called my artifact gun violence. and a certain kind of community is hailed by that term. I could have brought another artifact to our workshop that would be exactly the same, but it would be called personal safety. And that would hail another community altogether. Each heritage discourse aims to unite people through shared values. In this case, we all oppose violence. We all want to be safe. But even as they aim to unite, the fact of differing heritage language, indeed contradictory language, violence, safety, is witness to deeply fissured interpretations of the Second Amendment, the originating document of each one of these intangible cultural heritages, and radically disparate groups. So as Waldemar Hofstein analyzed it, and as my artifact makes abundantly clear, heritage making is deeply clear. When heritages collide could well be the name of our current era. So I'll now, on that somber note, I'll turn it over to Christine. But first, before then, I want to thank our partners in organizing the conference. As Kathleen mentioned, Owen Williams, and also Morgan Ellison at the Folger, Christine Hoffmann and Laura Farina at WVU, Grace Smith and Jackson Rotary also at WVU. All very patient and just excellent collaborators in this process. So, Christine, over to you.
Thank you. Yeah, I want to talk a little bit, I guess, more specifically about where we are right now, Morgantown, West Virginia, University in particular. But yeah, I do want to first echo Carolyn and thanking everybody for joining us here online and in person. You've seen our pretty full program for the 2.5 days that we have together. Like Carolyn said, a lot of speakers coming from a range of disciplines and specialties. And I wanted to just share a little bit more about the rationale for that. Starting with a
Screen sharing.
So I have to get up.
Oh, I can do it. You did.
Yeah, just click. Advance.
Okay.
I have the screen.
Okay, that's it.
Yep.
Here?
Yep.
Okay.
Sorry about that. Bought this. Yeah, so this is a quotation from another of the readings that you might have gotten to in the Google Drive, Laura Jane Smith's Thesis of Heritage. She writes, at one level, heritage is about the promotion of a consensus version of history by state-sanctioned cultural institutions and elites to regulate cultural and social tensions in the present. And this is what she refers to as authorized heritage discourse, or AHD, throughout the rest of that book and in a lot of her writings. She continues, on the other hand, heritage may also be a resource that is used to challenge and redefine received values and identities by a range of subaltern groups. Heritage is not necessarily about the stasis of cultural values and meanings, but may equally be about cultural change. Heritage is about negotiation. So I think we've designed a program that's going to help us see and move and talk, negotiate beyond an authorized heritage discourse that limits what is identified as heritage to the tangible, the monumental, the picturesque, the professionally curated or expertly authenticated, the passively consumed or revered, the tourist ready. And I think Morgantown is a fitting, if challenging, site to host this kind of negotiation, because the state of West Virginia and this institution, WVU, are, for probably obvious reasons, very attached to the authorized heritage discourse. This is a state that saw, This is a state that saw the largest outmigration percentages of any state from 2010 to 2020. And like, it wasn't even close in terms of the percentages. To compensate for that, to correct it, and I think begin to reverse this trend, state leadership has invested heavily in tourism campaigns that present West Virginia as a kind of nature preserve, a site so grandly picturesque that coming here, it just inspires you to start singing the John Denver song, whether you know it or not. And that the video that's playing now, I haven't muted, but a cover of Country Roads is playing over the whole thing. And one reason I haven't muted is because I don't like the cover. I don't like it. Yeah, and then they have to almost heaven kind of shows up right at the end there. So the early monarchist in me wants to spend the next 2 hours considering the Miltonic undertones of a phrase like almost heaven. It doesn't present as difficult a puzzle as something like darkness visible, palpable obscure, or precious bane, or some other of Milton's paradoxical descriptions for hell and its environs. I think it's actually closer to Milton's language for Eve. She's the one who's said to yield to Adam with modest pride, with sweet, reluctant, amorous delay, whatever that means. Nobody knows. After the fall, when he's wishing her uncreated, Adam refers to her as this fair defect of nature. It is Satan, of course, who responds to his own fallen position. That, that famous quotation, the mind is its own place and in itself can make a heaven of hell, a hell of heaven. A claim that Eve echoes with some important modifications when in the last speech of the poem, she says to Adam, with thee to go is to stay here, paradise. Without thee here to stay is to go. Thou to me are all things under heaven, all places thou. So almost heaven, it may not meet all the criteria for satanic or Miltonic speech. I'm just going to call it for now a weird flex. And admit that I am suspicious of it when it shows up outside of song and inside authorized heritage discourse. I want to also show you some quotations from our Governor Jim Justice. This is from an event last March where he was announcing some new tourism campaigns. I'll just read it first and then kind of talk about why it's up here. He writes, or he said during this event, and he had baby dog in a chair next to him. That's his bulldog that he brings with him to sometimes, well, never mind. Sometimes, so he likes to communicate through baby dogs, but really, there's no other way to say it. Just look it up. Everyone in the outside world wants a piece of West Virginia. Today's announcements are just testimony to all the goodness that's going on all around us. All we ever needed in the state was a coach, someone who believed enough to put a stake in the sand and commit real dollars to show the outside world how good we really are. From there, the people come in floods, and that's exactly what we've done. We've invested, and all of a sudden we turn around and there's money upon money coming our way. All of a sudden, the state is now known far and wide as the diamond in the rough that everyone missed. So if you've read anything from King Dinshaw, one of our speakers, we're going to hear from that last part about diamond in the rough, might already be raising your eyebrows. Justice is consistent in his reliance on authorized heritage discourse when it comes to advocating for his state. He urges listeners toward a consensus version of what West Virginia has to offer, what it's always had to offer as this Edenic refuge, this land outside of normal space and time that's been overlooked by the world, and it's ready finally to use its transcendent properties to remake that world and remake itself. It's actually not Milton that came to mind when I was watching this press conference, but the speaker of Andrew Marvell's The Garden, in that disquieting part of the poem where he suggests all that's made could be annihilated to a green thought in a green shade. Or I guess if you're to justice, just a sea of green money, just coming with the flood of people. Justice's language is forward-looking, but conceptually it relies on the image of a mythified past in which West Virginia is stuck in time and place as a perfectly preserved, a more than Eden after all is closed off to fallen man. West Virginia, though, is open for business. That, by the way, was another state-sponsored slogan. Didn't really take off the way that Almost Heaven did. West Virginia University, meanwhile, relies, I think, on a similar understanding. Oh yeah, I have the card. Relies on a similar understanding and preservation of West Virginia's extra Edenic past in order to make coherent its present identity and its future ambitions as an institution. The most frequent messaging includes the language "Mountaineers go first" and/or "Let's go." Odd, I think, for a state that has out-migration problems to tell students, let's go. Nobody asked me. Here are a couple of additional screenshots from the official brand guide. And you can see there, I think, what you'd expect, the kind of language that you might see from an official brand platform. But for all its, entrepreneurial, future-oriented kind of buzzwords, the brand guide is tethered to imagery that calls up, again, this kind of mythified past that's inhabited by a key figure, the pioneering mountaineer, the rugged individual blazing a path through uncultivated and seemingly unpeopled wilderness, leading the way through a no man's land. I think this is how WVU, the brand platform at least, has the past and eats it too, in a way, how it carves a rustic frame around every innovation, how it backs up every commitment to progress with some retrogressive claim, like, for example, that such commitment to progress is in our blood, in our nature. This is a place where you can earn a reputation for careful, contemplative problem solving, and you can jump into situations headfirst, undaunted by obstacles. You are Act 5 Hamlet, you defy augury, the readiness is all. And I know that some of our speakers are going to help us see this more clearly. This is typical of how the pre-modern past enters modern discourse as a time to be, in part, rejected for its vaguely understood ugliness or unsophistication in comparison to a modernized age. And yet that pre-modern past is also embraced in part for being the source of that pioneering spirit that is still somehow an institutional shorthand for how the world gets bettered. Going first is presented without apology or irony as heroic rather than destructive, rather than greedy, rather than violent or reckless. That's the consensus around going first. And as someone who works here, that's the consensus that I would like to negotiate. I thank everybody in this room and the folks joining on Zoom for being here to offer insight on how to begin and how to continue negotiations with consensus pushing bodies in our classrooms, in our careers, in our lives as citizens of wherever it is that we call home or that we hear calling us home. And I think with that, I am prepared to say let's go.
Okay, I'll take up that challenge. So I think now we turn to our four speakers for tonight. Our format will be that the four of you will open with some remarks. We said short-ish remarks, and then we will just throw things open for discussion among the four of you, among the group, among the larger virtual gathering. So I think I'll introduce all four at once, and then we can just start the conversation. And I think I'll start with Mary Louise Pratt, She might hear that. She is. And then go on to Mike, Kim, and Lowell. So Mary Louise Pratt is Professor Emerita of Social and Cultural Analysis and Spanish and Portuguese at NYU. Her book, Imperial Eyes, Travel Writing and Transculturation, was published in 1992 with the second edition in 2008. It still seems so fresh and full of relevance, perhaps more so as we worry about contact zones in these pandemic times and try to stay 6 feet away from each other. Her new book, Planetary Longings, was just published last month by Duke. Mike Costello, chef farmer at Lost Creek Farms, is from West Virginia, studied right here at the journalism school at WVU. He's a storyteller with a commitment to place and, of course, culinary arts and traditions. Kim Folger is associate professor of Spanish at Randolph-Macon College in Virginia, and is an Appalachian native herself. She's just last year published Appalachia as Contested Borderland of the Early Modern Atlantic, 1828 to 1715, which tells the fascinating and complex story of the European obsession with Appalachian resources. Her research puts Appalachia into global histories, Atlantic, Latin America, as well as early America, thus demonstrating that this region is far from an isolated backwater. And Lowell Ducker is returning to WVU, where he taught in the English department before moving to the University of Delaware. His intellectual interests are broad, according to his bio, which I didn't fact check, so I guess there could be some padding here. But according to his bio, he's published on glaciers, polar bears, the color maroon, rain, peace, mountaintop removal mining, and lagoons. In addition to several edited volumes, he published For All Waters, Finding Ourselves in Early Modern Wetscapes with Minnesota in 2017. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Mary Louise.
Okay, hello everybody. Greetings from Oakland, California. I wish I were there in person. That was certainly the plan. I'm not participating under conditions of my own choosing. I'm recovering from eye surgery, hence the pirate look. But if you want to start a trend, that's cool. And I'm looking after a rambunctious 5-year-old and his 5-day-old brother who is making his debut in the world. So that's my context, but I am very, very happy to be with you to discuss these topics that I find just riveting and fascinating and significantly high stakes. So let me just launch into my brief remarks. In the early 2000s, I worked briefly on theorizing intangible heritage with a Mexican team that was contributing to the UNESCO effort that Hoffmann describes in his article. It occurred to me then that language might be an example par excellence of intangible heritage. In contrast with material artifacts, intangible creations endure only through active, socially maintained processes of transmission from older to younger practitioners. And these transmissions usually involve training, apprenticeships, sizable investments of time and energy that have to be meaningful and rewarding for all those who undertake them. And language, of course, exists in just this way. So it might provide an illuminating paradigm, I thought, for intangible heritage and for research in particular on the question of transmission. So intangible heritage studies often focus on the product, the ritual, the cooking recipe or whatever, but I think thinking through language helps us realize also the importance of thinking about transmission. The ways that expertise is transmitted or reproduced over time down generations. Language learning, whether it's your first or subsequent languages, we're taught to think of language learning as something that happens automatically with children, but in fact, that isn't the case at all. learning your first language requires 5 things in abundance. It requires time, effort, motivation, input, and opportunities for use. And literacy requires a 6th element, which is instruction. And linguistic communities lay down social arrangements and practices that provide these elements. That's why it's interesting to think about intangible heritage in this way. And the breakdown of those arrangements of transmission is the only way languages can die. That is through the interruption of the circuit of transmission from older to younger speakers. And this usually comes about through some kind of drastic disruption of social and material life. So I thought at the time then, and I still think now in a way, that it might be productive to extend this way of thinking to the expressive forms identified as items of intangible heritage. Perhaps the descriptions of these items should include information on how they are transmitted, through what relationships, what institutions, what pedagogical practices and value structures. And we're challenged to think about how you can build those dimensions into the concept of intangible heritage. Now, when people start talking about pure and less pure forms of languages, however, we are in the terrain of language ideology. Let me just, the claim made about the preservation of purer forms of language in traditional, more isolated rural communities that was discussed in connection with Appalachia has been made in the Americas, not just for English in Appalachia, but also for Spanish in northern New Mexico and for French in rural Quebec. And it's based on the romantic stereotype of peasant premodernity that's a combination kind of authenticity and civilizational deficit summed up in the word archaic. And in the case of all 3 languages, the archaic form of the language that is preserved is explicitly associated with 17th century literary golden ages. In each case, Shakespeare in Appalachia, Cervantes and Lope de Vega in New Mexico, Corneille Molière in France, or in French America. So it's clear that the kind of long afterlife of empire is partly in evidence here, but not in a simple way. The reason those 17th century literary golden ages return in this way, I think, is because they are inextricably linked to the tremendous expansion of material wealth, creative energy, knowledge, imaginative challenges that imperial expansion catalyzed in those imperial countries. And that's part of what's being recalled in the recovery of the archaic authenticity of the language. And in all 3 countries, interestingly enough, imperial expansion was accompanied specifically by efforts to homogenize themselves linguistically, to standardize and purify language. And I connect that in my own thinking to the fact that strong empires and strong states require lingua francas, that is authorized or pure forms of the language. And the canonical case of this connection with language and empire is Spain, of course, where Nebrija's Gramática de la Lengua Española appeared in 1492, along with Columbus. And in his introduction, he refers to language as the perfect instrument of empire. In the case of French, the first French grammar the Port Royal grammar has the same name as the first French settlement in North America in 1629, and the 2 appeared 30 years apart. In English, Bullocher's pamphlet to grammar appeared just 20 years before the Jamestown settlement. Linguistic standardization then seemed to accompany imperial designs. And of course, in the context of Euro-imperialism, it's like a tiny wee hop from language to blood and from linguistic purity to racial purity. And in all 3 cases, English, Spanish, and French in the Americas, this linguistic archaism is also a badge of whiteness, of unstained connection to European origins. So traditional and isolated African-American or indigenous or mixed race communities don't appear in our linguistic mythologies as sources for pure or archaic forms, though they certainly could be. Mestizaje, as Lou in his piece indicates, is built into the imperial script, and the linguistic purity fantasies in part are part of a structure of denial, I think. But there's another twist to all this, because as Lou notes, the isolated rural communities who retain these putatively archaic, non-standard forms take pride in them. And I associate this with the fact that these communities are also resistant communities in the Americas. They are resistant to Anglo rule in New Mexico, to English rule in French Canada, and Northern urban rule in Appalachia. And linguistic distinctiveness is a source of solidarity and community, and non-standard forms are a source or a sign of resistance. It's also interesting to add, kind of thinking about afterlives of empire, that to a significant degree, these communities derive from resistant communities before they came to the Americas, which is why people left Europe. So in Quebec, French Huguenots came as settlers fleeing oppression in France. In the case of northern New Mexico, it was Spanish conversos, closet Jews, or people forced to convert to Catholicism who wanted to recover Judaism. In Appalachia, there's a connection to Scots, Irish, Welsh, sometimes Gaelic speaking, sometimes Roman Catholic communities from the British Isles. So that resistant quality is part of the founding narrative of some of these communities, and it gets passed on partly as heritage. Thinking about intangible heritage, reading the readings that we received, I think it would be unfortunate if the parameters laid down by the Hallstein essay circumscribed our conversations here. He really is speaking of what people call the UN-ification of heritage. And I think that his essay problematizes itself in ways that can be very productive for us. Hallstein seems to think that people don't, or he seems to suggest that people don't know how to recognize or value or safeguard heritage until they are instructed and reformed by some external party. And that word in reform keeps turning up in the strange way in the piece. I found the approach taken by Smith that Christine mentioned more generative, where heritage is seen in part as these continuous processes of self-making that individuals and collectivities engage in, carrying them on from those who went before and making and remaking as you go. So that's heritage not as a discourse, but rather as a force. Heritage is a force that can make things happen wherever it is present, and though we cannot ever predict exactly what those things will be. And I tried a little bit to develop an approach like that in Planetary Longings. Finally, I'm fascinated by the normativity that remains implicit in Hallstein's account. Heritage, to him, is always a good thing. He says, who could be against helping cultural traditions survive? He asks on page 5, in parentheses. And yet we don't see the UNESCO commissions beatifying, say, headhunting or child marriage or warfare or honor killing, though there are communities whose core identities have revolved around these things. And here I would take the homegrown example that Carolyn brought up. When I read the Hallstein's definition of UNESCO's kind of priorities, heritage definitions last week, I couldn't help thinking of what had just happened in Buffalo, the racist massacre, and the discursive and material apparatuses that produced it. So to quote the essay, cultural practices and expressions that represent the diversity of human creative powers. They give aesthetic form to deeply held values. They speak of skill and competence, of bonds that tie, and of different relationships to history, society, and nature. They testify to the various ways people tend to previous generations, to other people, and to the universe. And in a way, I think in an uncanny way, the Buffalo shooter was embedded in such a patrimonial regime, which is the term that was used. He was performing heritage, or he believed himself to be performing heritage. And like so many instances of these shootings, his physical act was accompanied by a voluminous written component and a vibrant, active community. So my question here is that white supremacy, as it has burgeoned in this country, looks like what Hoffmann calls a patrimonial regime. And it is safeguarded not by UNESCO, of course, but by a host of other agents. So in a perhaps uncanny way, it seems to check all the boxes that Hoffmann identifies for patrimonial regimes. To quote him, a particular regime of truth, all at once material and ethical, economic and emotional, scientific and sensory, a system of values, a set of practices, a formation of knowledge, a structure of feeling, and a moral code. Those things were all intensely in play in, for example, the Buffalo shooting. Although deeply implicated in industry and government, its rhetoric is primarily moral. So it's really interesting to see whether it makes sense to still argue, as Hoffmann does, that no discussion of the patrimonial regime is complete without reference to UNESCO and to its international success story. More productively, though, I think perhaps his formulations and UNESCO's formulations, as Carolyn suggested, can help societies figure out how to proceed when heritage becomes a field of civilizational struggle. How would a UNESCO identify, or how would communities identify intangible heritages that are harming or destroying them? And is the enemy might be racism in the United States, but in Afghanistan it might be gender equality and feminism. Is it possible to interrupt the transmission of regimes within the societies that host them? In the case of white supremacy, many of us thought such an interruption had happened already here, and we were completely wrong. Finally, I want to think about how heritage travels and suggest this is a topic. Intangibility gives intangible heritage an uncanny ability to travel. And indeed, like language, it can be impossible to leave behind the intangible. It goes with you whether you like it or not. So along with thinking about transmission, I think it's fascinating to ask what happens when heritage travels or spreads or goes viral. And I wanted to leave us with an example of traveling heritage from a celebrated and revered Appalachian icon, Dolly Parton. As many of you know, she grew up in the Smoky Mountains as Wikipedia says, in a one-room house that in her early years had no running water or electricity. Her father was a sharecropper. Her mother had 12 children by the time she was 35. Parton's mother was Welsh, of Welsh extraction, and it was she, who brought music and song into their daily life as lining up with the Appalachian myth. Parton was a successful songwriter by the time she was 16 and also a businesswoman. The day after she graduated from high school, she left for Nashville, and she took Appalachia with her, her heritage with her, and she performs it in every single thing she has said and done ever since. The particular text I want to refer to is in 1976 on her TV show, she invited two other vocalists, fellow vocalists, to join her in singing an Appalachian tune. The two other vocalists were products of entirely different song traditions. Emmylou Harris, who'd begun in folk and moved to country, and Linda Ronstadt, who began with Mexican music in Arizona and moved to rock. The song they sing, that Dolly proposed they sing, is a beautiful and kind of strangely ambivalent ode to motherhood. I'm introducing it here just for its beauty, but I also am curious about what would we want to say about this performance as an act of heritage and history, both for us listening, and as you will see in their faces, for the singers performing it. So Christine, could you put the song on? It's called The Sweetest Gift. 2 minutes and 41 seconds.
One day when all sweetest gift, a mother's smile. Can I sing one now? She left a smile you can remember. She's gone to heaven from heartache free. Those walls around you could never change her. You were her baby, and there will be. She did not bring to him a parole or pardon. He brought no silver gold, none to see. It was a halo sent down from heaven, like the sweetest gift, a mother's smile. She did not bring him a parole or pardon. She brought no silver gold, none to see. It was a halo sent down from heaven, like the sweetest gift, a mother's smile. The sweetest gift, a mother's smile.
Before you go to bed tonight, drink a glass of
What's next?
Carolyn? Yeah. Hi, I'm Mike Costello. I am a chef, as Carolyn said, and I am a farmer, and Amy here just my partner, we're in Lost Creek Farm together. And yeah, we're cooks and we're farmers, but at the heart of sort of everything we do is stories. So we're storytellers in a lot of ways, and our food is kind of the vehicle for how we tell these stories. And it is interesting to be part of this discussion, focused on heritage, especially as folks who are sort of outside of academia, but also someone as people who are thinking about and talking about this notion of heritage all the time. And I didn't have any prepared remarks because we talk about this stuff so much that it's usually better if we just don't, because I pick up on certain things. Like I was taking notes when Christine was showing the quotes from Jim Justice, and I wrote down the fact that he highlights that we want to show the outside world who we are, right? Rarely are we sort of defining these things for the people who live here. We're always sort of defining this for somebody else. That's part of what inspired Amy and I to do what we do now. And we both grew up in West Virginia. We both paid a lot of attention to the storylines, the way that certain things, heritage was being defined. And when we started this business about 7 years ago, it was sort of at this weird time when this concept of Appalachian cuisine was being heralded as this trendy thing in the national media. And you could open up an Appalachian magazine, you could say like, oh, well, here are the 10 food trends to expect 2016 or whenever it was. And Appalachian food was always at the top of the list. And it was funny to us because they always sort of wanted to define what fit into that. They wanted to create a box and then to define what fit in, right? And usually that wasn't really, the definition wasn't really being created by people of this place, of these communities, was sort of like this outside media narrative of what to expect. And what sort of happened was a lot of people from outside the region were kind of capitalizing on this opportunity to sort of commodify cultural heritage from this region. And that was, to us, we were just sort of sitting back and watching this, being in a place like West Virginia, and sort of wondering how the hell any of this is going to benefit us, right? Like, I was, as a journalist, I was getting pitches from people that were like, you're really excited about this. So there's an award-winning chef from New York City who's opening an Appalachian restaurant. Quality is coming to Appalachian food, right? Like, it was sort of like, if there's quality in West Virginia, we sort of have to import it from somewhere else, like create an image of like, what is quality of Appalachia for somebody else. So Amy and I, we had sort of been thinking about this concept for this business for so long, and then it was just sort of like all of this stuff was coming together, and this sort of what I think a lot of people tended to look at as like this great opportunity in terms of marketability or whatever for Appalachian food. It was, for us, it was like, okay, this is what we see as like an opportunity to sort of disrupt this conversation a little bit about what heritage means, and sort of what the conversation around Appalachian food and Appalachianness as a whole could be, and we thought that food was a pretty good place to start that conversation for a lot of reasons. But it's really interesting. I think there's such a parallel between like listening to someone talk about language in place and to talk about food in place, because in food there's a lot of language, and there's a lot that food is telling us, and a lot that we're telling ourselves and telling other people about the food that we eat. So there's endless sort of parallels. And then the fact that languages come here, food comes here, they come here at the same time, and we talk a lot to folks in former immigrant communities and newer recent immigrant communities about food and about language, and it's like a lot of times you come here or move anywhere else, and you have these sort of, we often hear about these sort of three pillars of culture. It's like your language, your food, or the sort of things that the three sort of most common things that people talk about expressing as a culture when they come to a new place. And the language often goes, the music often goes, but the one thing that sort of sticks around more than those other two things is the food. And in that food, there is a lot of language. But when we were looking at all of this stuff back in that time, 2015 to 2016, when all of those lists were being created, and there was this idea of heritage food, there was also a lot of talk about heritage in other contexts, white supremacy. How many times were we, this was leading up to the 2016 election, and we were seeing rallies all over the place. There's that constant campaign with the Confederate flag, and then like heritage, sort of thing, right? So we were very aware of the way that, here we are trying to sort of create some conversation around what heritage looks like in the context of food, but also being very careful about how we use that term, because it's such a dog whistle in so many ways for whiteness and white supremacy. And the place, like, especially in a place like Appalachia, is considered, to be so overwhelmingly white to the point that that's just sort of how everything gets defined, like both from the inside and the outside. So, it was sort of like there was all this stuff kind of happening, and a lot of conversation sort of centered around heritage, but I think all of these things just sort of like reinforce the need for us to kind of start more conversations through food about what heritage kind of means, what Appalachianness kind of means. And the funny thing about me saying that is that like we there's not like a meaning that we try to sort of put out there and say like, okay, this is the definition for it. But I think like where we try to establish meaningness is like, that like, we can't really define for people who live here, like what their relationship to place sort of means. It's one of those things where you can kind of like recognize it when it's there, but you can also sort of really recognize it when it's not, and we were recognizing it when it wasn't, when we were seeing this sort of commodification from the outside of this Appalachianness. And we're sort of seeing this boxing in of what heritage should be. And we were hearing from somebody based in a totally different place that the things that we were putting on the plate were not Appalachian, or they were not representative of the heritage of this place. And that said a lot about that kind of media narrative, and about the expectation that was being set by this sort of trend of Appalachianness. And if we would go to DC or wherever and we would do a dinner there, and it would be like, people, this didn't happen a lot, but it would happen where people would kind of come up to us afterwards and say like, I came here because it was sort of advertised as an Appalachian. And that, you fed Lebanese things and you fed Spanish things, and those are important moments because then you can start the conversation about who gets the privilege to be considered Appalachian and who doesn't. And you get to start the conversation about, the 20,000 Spanish immigrants that moved to Harrison County in the early 1900s to work in the zinc smelters, or the vast Lebanese communities of Charleston, where I grew up in southern West Virginia. We have a bunch of recipes from those communities, and we're in community with folks in the Spanish community who taught us their heritage sausage recipes and their a bunch of their culinary traditions. And I think that those moments are important because there's like this sort of living, breathing element to all of those things, even after the language is gone, the music is gone, and it's like you sort of get to a point where maybe it is still kind of hard to define like what the sort of precise parameters are around heritage or Appalachian cuisine, but it's like you're there making sausage and you're hearing people talk about how they came here, how their families came here, and there's just this like you feel the connection to place, and you sort of like feel this like living, breathing element that is being kept alive through those acts of community and through those acts of building community, bringing us in and sharing traditions. So it's been sort of this really interesting ride to keep having these conversations over the years and sort of keep trying to challenge this sort of idea of stereotype. And a lot of times like we get really fed up and people talk about pushing back stereotypes, because usually what a lot of times what that means is there's this people just don't want to be seen as being poor. And it comes down to that, and the way we talk about it, poverty in America is that like you've like screwed up somehow. It is personal failure. It's not because this is state that is like controlled by extractive industry and you're born into these systems. No, it's like you've screwed up. And there's class signifiers in the food that we eat. So like oftentimes it's like we're talking about heritage cuisine and we're using this terminology, but we're sort of afraid to make people from the outside world again feel that we are poor, because we don't want people from the outside world to think that we like screwed something up. So I love that you used the West Virginia tourism campaigns in your opening remarks, because we have this sort of constant battle with the tourism department about food, because they'll use the sort of buzzwords about heritage cuisine or authentic cuisine, which is great, right? But like the pictures will always be seared scallops or lobster tail or, you know, something, and like, you know, I mean, the messaging is very clear. It's like, you know, to the outside world, it's like, we're not as poor as you think, right? So like we're not as active as you think. You know, and like, that's so problematic in a lot of ways, you know, for, you know, people out of a place to sort of look at the way that their state government is marketing the state to the outside world, and they, you know, they basically like with this messaging that, you know, whatever the people eat here, like that's not what you're gonna get when you come here, right? Like we have quality things here too. Like we've got the stuff that we have back home, and that's why you should come. And it's like, to me, it's like that's such a bizarre way to try to market why somebody should visit the place. It's like you can experience exactly what you get back home, right? Like come here. I mean, so we think about these things in terms of tourism campaigns and the way we're marketing things and the way that we market things to the outside world. And that's like, even though our business sort of relies on tourism in a lot of ways, like our audience for us is from West Virginia is sort of like always prioritized for like the people who are of this place, you know, because there's like always a need to sort of tell a different story. And I talk about, you know, with food traditions in terms of the perceptions of poverty a lot, because like one of the most common themes we hear around people who have this rich, what they would identify as culinary heritage in their families, like we hear this constant story from people who will say, you know, there's a particular dish, chow chow, vinegar pie, something like that, and I loved it when I grew up. But when I became an adult, I told myself I would never eat it again. And the reason for that is not because they don't like it anymore, it's because they associate that with hard times, and they know the prevailing narrative about poverty, which is, again, that it's like this personal failure. So it's like they connect the dots and they say, well, like, you know, if this is a food that represents poverty, then, you know, people will think a certain way about us, you know, about our family, about who we are, and we hear these heartbreaking stories of these delicious foods that, you know, people will say, like, I told my mom never to make that if my friends were coming, because I didn't want people to think that we, you know, were poor. So a lot of sort of our job is to kind of flip the script on some of those narratives, and it's like, it's an amazing thing when it sort of happens, because you know, people will come to like a dinner and they'll sit at the table and the story that they've always been told about chow chow. So chow chow, for someone who doesn't know, chow chow is like this, it's like this hodgepodge of like all the leftovers from the garden. You chop them up real fine, you pickle them. So it's like if you're canning a batch of beans, and you're canning a batch of peppers, and you're canning a batch of tomatoes, you have a little bit left over from all of this. So you mix it all together and you make this relish, this pickled relish. And, you know, it's something that people ate when they were under hard times, you know, but it's so delicious and so bright, and it's like, it's got all this complexity to it. There's nothing to be embarrassed about with chow chow, right? Like, but because of that association, there are people that, you know, will not eat it. And it's amazing when people will say, you know, like, I'm going to go home and I'm going to make chow chow again, because like this is the first time that I've been told a story about chow chow, about it representing this sort of thrift and resourcefulness, this innovation, this like creativity to make something so beautiful out of very little. And that's something that I can be kind of proud of, and that I can like take this and share it with somebody else and keep making it. So it's like those points of conversation are really important, because there is this part of, you know, that culinary heritage that is like very beautiful and nourishing and sustaining, but at the same time, we're very aware of like this sort of idea that people seek out heritage narratives here just sort of just like feel good, you know? And there's a lot of complexity. We always tell ourselves in Appalachia that we want the real story, like the full story. We're frustrated by the way that people are talking about us from the outside, so we want to like really the story, but we don't really invite the narratives about you know, some of the sort of less savory parts of our past. And I think it's really important when you talk about food, because when you are given a recipe or you're given a seed, something like that, you're sort of also given this responsibility to share its story, just the way that we want our story to be told. So I brought a tangible something about a rather intangible act of heritage, and that's the culture of seed saving. So we've spent a lot of time in the garden this week, and we plant a lot of heirloom crops. And this is a corn called Bloody Butcher corn, and it's an heirloom grade corn that was cultivated here in this region. But I'm going to pass it around, and I've got some little bags here. If you have a garden or something you'd actually like to grow some of this corn, feel free to take a couple of kernels and plant them. But with this corn, you know, as you hold it, I want you to think about some things. I mean, with each of these kernels, one of these kernels will make 2 of these ears. So that's about 1,600 kernels that can go theoretically to 1,600 different people who can plant them, and they can keep this corn alive, and they can feed so many people. And there's so much power in that this corn has such a unique personality, and it's got a unique story, and it is seen so much. In the story of this corn is not necessarily about the seed savers who passed it down to us, but it's about the people who stewarded this corn here before their land was stolen, before this was taken from them and their communities. And if we, are unwilling to share those stories, it's a real shame, because this is a story that wants to be shared. And part of taking care of that corn is like I said, like passing that story down. So, sorry. Talking discussion.
Thanks, Mark.
I have been working this spring at leaving myself off of having written remarks, but to organize my thoughts, I kind of jump started and then things started to flow. So I am going to read. Thank you, Carolyn, for your remarks about your cultural artifact, which I wish it were not necessary to bring. I've been looking forward to this event all spring, and yesterday I was barely able to get out of bed. I'm so sorry for your family and everyone else. So that was not written down, but I couldn't not acknowledge it. So before I start, I'd like to extend my heartfelt thanks to Carolyn, Christine, Folger Institute, the West Virginia Humanities Council, whose name I noticed was also on the flyer, and West Virginia University for their organizing, funding, and hosting this event, respectively. I can't overstate my gratitude for being here tonight at this convergence of minds that share both a love of place and a need to deeply interrogate what it means to be Appalachian. I don't think I need to convince anybody participating in this weekend's workshops that shared understandings or misunderstandings of the past shape the reality of the present. My book about the history of Appalachia is the creation of competing 16th and 17th century Atlantic empires, rather than as a place of 18th and 19th century Scotch-Irish frontiersmen or 20th century stereotypes, is what gave me a seat at this table tonight. So I'm not here to repeat the arguments made in that book, but I don't assume that everyone here has read it, or even that many people here have read it. So I will say that the book is about the fact that Appalachia itself, as a place and as an idea, was born of both naive rumors and imperialist fantasies about the Appalachian people of 16th century Florida, and their supposed kingdom of gold. Those fantasies, as well as some unfortunate early modern map making based more on wishful thinking than North American geography. See if this works. Ended up playing out on two major fronts. The first of these fronts, of course, was the European naming and invasion of the mountains now known as Appalachia, where we sit today. The other front was in the Gulf South, where the Appalachian people, whose name was mistakenly put on the Appalachian Mountains, the Gulf South, where the Appalachian people saw themselves forced out of their ancestral homeland in Western Florida and eventually displaced in the 18th century to central Louisiana, where they reside today. Without employing the terminology with which this weekend's workshops have been framed, my book insisted that a proper historicizing of Appalachian heritage must include an acknowledgement of the role played by the European obsession with Appalachian gold in the borderlands and contact zones of Spanish Florida. Today, in the heart of Appalachia, I come to you to propose that any meaningful consideration of that obsession, so typical of 16th century European expansionism, further demands engagement with the 21st century Talamale band of Appalachian Indians and with their plight as a diasporic people forced from their homeland and still struggling to return there today, 5 centuries after first contact with Europeans. So what is the intangible cultural heritage of Appalachia and the Appalachia? A place and a people forever bound together by the all too tangible violence brought by men's infatuation with gold. Again, without making use of that terminology, this was the question I asked myself in May 2021, almost exactly a year ago, when I received the long-awaited copies of my book. Given the apocalyptic tenor of many of the first-person accounts, as well as contemporary histories of Appalachia and European confrontations in the colonial era, it was relatively late in my research that I realized that the Appalachia continue to exist as a tribal entity today. And I had a dilemma. I felt compelled to contact the tribe and offer them a copy of my book. But the book contains very little information about the Appalachian people themselves or their protagonism as historical actors. It documents the quixotic lengths to which agents of European empires went in the hopes of finding Appalachian gold. It documents the violence that those colonial agents wrought not just upon the Appalachian, but upon one another in their quest for that gold. And finally, it documents how a one-time governor of the Carolina province first claimed to have discovered Spanish silver mines in the Appalachian Mountains, and then ravaged the remaining Appalachian settlements of Spanish Florida, along with many others, in brutal slaving raids after his promises of Appalachian wealth never materialized. Yet very little of the story that I tell touches upon the quote unquote real Appalachia. Might it not be the ultimate act of academic narcissism to assume that my years of research on the obscure colonial origins of modern Appalachia would be of any interest at all to the living, breathing Appalachian people? The same people who had been forced into the shadows, first by the US government, then by the Ku Klux Klan until the 1990s, and who remain entrenched in a legal battle to be reinstated as a federally recognized tribe today. Ultimately, it was the late Appalachian chief Gilmer Bennett who made the call for me. In a 2005 article in the Wall Street Journal, Tony Horowitz describes the disbelief of Florida archaeologist Bonnie McEwen the day she answered the phone and heard Bennett's southern drawl on the other end announce itself as belonging to the chief of the Appalachian Indians. McEwen reacted roughly the way that any one of us would if someone were to call and introduce himself as Moctezuma, Emperor of Mexico. She assumed she was being pranked. Fortunately, she didn't hang up, and the phone call soon evolved into an enduring friendship. With that anecdote to boost my courage, I called the number I found on Facebook for the Talamale Band of Appalachian Indians of Louisiana. After entertaining my rather awkward introduction, Renee Bennett, sister-in-law of tribal chief Arthur Bennett, agreed for me to send the tribe a copy of my book. 2 weeks later, as I sat on an Appalachian hilltop staring at the flicker of fireflies and the beginnings of a summer storm, my phone rang and the southern drawl on the other end asked, "Want to write another book?" In the introduction that we read for this weekend, the introduction to Making Intangible Heritage, Valdemar Hofstein argues that it is imperative to study the various local relationships into which intangible heritage enters when different social actors mobilize this concept in diverse contexts on the ground and around the world. It is incumbent on us to follow the topics we study where they go. I will not have time to write another book until at least mid-2023, but over the course of the last year, I have followed my topic where it seems to want to go. Via the limited circuit of conferences and invited talks at which I've been able to speak as humanity drags itself out of the COVID pandemic, I have been attempting to raise a broader awareness of the fact that the Appalachia are still here. They still know who they are, and they need help to go home to Florida. I've been in touch with some of the foremost archaeologists and ethnohistorians of Florida and the American South, several of whom have subsequently participated in a symposium on the missions of Spanish Florida with Appalachian Chief Arthur Bennett and his brother, colloquially known as TJ. The Appalachia are a tribe of 200 to 300 people, very much alive and with a functioning tribal government, but lacking the millions of dollars potentially necessary to litigate their case in front of Congress and the federal government. Until a few decades ago, even leading experts in Florida history and anthropology believed them to be extinct. The Appalachians spent 1834 to 1939 hiding in the Louisiana swamps and backcountry to evade the predations of US speculators, the Ku Klux Klan, and the US government. In 1951, when the US Forestry Department seized the remaining Appalachian lands in Bayou Seat, they burnt all the buildings on the property to the ground, including the house of Gilmer Boy Valerie, great-grandfather of current Chief Arthur Bennett and his brother TJ. Gilmer Boy was home at the time the house was set on fire. He was pulled from the blaze by his nephews, but later died from his injuries in Monroe, Louisiana, where the surviving tribal members had already fled. Yet despite the centuries of persecution, dispossession, and murder perpetrated by both state and non-state agents, it is now incumbent upon the Appalachia to prove not only that they exist, but that they share cultural continuity, or perhaps intangible cultural heritage, with the people first encountered by Spanish treasure seekers in 16th century Florida. What can be done? In short, the Appalachian need a small army of Hofstein's aptly dubbed social actors willing to mobilize in diverse contexts on the ground, and if not around the world, at least around the country. Because the lawyer previously in their employ died suddenly, they desperately require the counsel of an expert in tribal law. They are also engaged in a protracted legal struggle to repatriate ancestral remains that have been kept in a box on a shelf in Florida, in the words of TJ Bennett, as he tried to get me caught up on the last 300 years of Appalachia history, while I watched the fireflies flicker in the rain and wondered how long I could stay on the phone before lightning struck that Southern Ohio ridgetop where I sat. On a more banal note, the Appalachian want to update their website and increase their presence on social media. This is both to spread awareness of their cause and to bury lower on the list of Google search results the website of an imposter group that has attempted to appropriate their tribal identity since learning that they might soon regain federal tribal status and with it, presumably, federal dollars. On a surprise and much more joyous note, a linguist has recently discovered in a Mexican archive roughly 10,000 documents in the Appalachian language, which has been lost for centuries. This creates the real possibility that, like the Wampanoag of New England, the Appalachian may soon be able to recover their language and all the cultural heritage, tangible and intangible, that it represents. So I ask again, what is the intangible cultural heritage of Appalachia and the Appalachia? What can those of us gathered here tonight, both in person and virtually, contribute to that heritage as a community of social actors, including literary and cultural critics, farmer chefs, artists, anthropologists, archaeologists, linguists, legal scholars, authors, musicians, activists? That book is still being written. It was my love of these mountains that led me to notice the similarity between the name of my home region and the 16th century Spanish rendering of the people now known as the Appalachia. It was a need to make meaning from that history that led me to risk ridicule as I cold called the Appalachian tribe at the height of a global pandemic to offer them a copy of my book in the hopes that it might help them more fully document the history of their persecution. And it is an attempt to make that meaning, to make sense of that convoluted, intangible heritage that brings me here tonight. Where will we go from here? Remains to be seen. I hope that wherever we go, the Appalachian will eventually go back to Florida, which is the sole motive of their current efforts. In light of that, I will end my remarks today with the most significant intangible cultural artifact I could find, a statement drafted by the Talamali band themselves to be read at this conference. Their words will follow. We, the Talamali band, the Appalachian Indians, are indeed still here. We've been here, waiting for the time our voice will be heard by people who are willing to help us as a tribe go home to Florida. We are called to Florida deep within our spirits. We feel the calling to the bone. It is indescribable to visit Florida and see actors dressed as Appalachian portraying us. We see items for sale in a gift shop which were not made by us. Our time spent in Louisiana has not produced a spirit of happiness. Our spirits hurt. Our tribe hid in the deep swamps from 1834 to 1900 when the swamp was drained. Our people were forced to relocate to a remote hill section nearby where a Catholic priest, Father Carpentier, found beaten paths leading to the Appalachian village, which had no road to it. After a little more than 10 years, the village was burned, our resources taken from us, our relatives murdered by clan members, our houses burned, and land taken to create a wilderness area. The Indians were forced to move to our current location in central Louisiana. Our culture is still intact, but fading away as time goes by. Our members have a sense of duty, a sense of family and traditions that have been passed down about the rules of the hunt. We do basket making and other things. We still live in a village-type setting with a communal garden, and we have tribal members that practice herbal medicine and the making of homemade spices. We lost our wealth when we lost our land. It is only through the land that our people are connected. For over 300 years, our people have been refugees, fleeing from changing governments and conflicts outside our control. We've been victims of the white man's disregard of our lives, such as being subjected to slavery, violence by the Ku Klux Klan, and Jim Crow laws. Throughout the years, some Appalachian married into white families. From time to time, these families approach us, not knowing any of our history or customs, and feel that their entire family should be allowed in as members due to one marriage between an Appalachian and their family. Their motive is usually about their family members getting a check, being gaming or the like. Many of these families demonstrate that they, as a group, do not hold our tribal values, and many of the new members have never identified as Indians. Thankfully, the academic community has not been fooled by these people. We are not interested in gaming. We have one central goal with our mission. We want to be welcomed home to our original land, which calls to us. Our tribal culture and beliefs are strong. We are excited to learn our past, newly rediscovered language. We need resources that we do not have to accomplish our goals. We ask for your help, and thank you for caring. Thank you.
Hey, get my objects. 30 seconds. All right. This is a nice hello, which hopefully will connect us on another topic. Yeah, those are all really powerful. Thanks for sharing those. Thanks, Carolyn and Kathleen and Christine and Laura. It's good to be back. It's just the elevation of talking.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I kind of have a mix. I'm similar. I think better when I can write it down. So I have some off the cuff comments and more of a kind of formal presentation. I'm going to start with this. So Sheila Marconti is a Inuit activist. This book came out a few years ago, and it's really influenced my work, which I'll talk about. But particularly this quote has really stuck with me. So she writes, "It was difficult for representatives from foreign countries to grasp the fact that ice is something that people depend on, not just for survival, but to thrive. Because as hard as it is for many people to understand, us Inuit, ice matters, ice is life." And so the thing that kind of tripped me up a little bit when I was thinking about intangible heritage was the word intangible. Like I was just trying to figure out what is that exactly? So hopefully I'm not like causing trouble by troubling that divide between the intangible and tangible. But so I'm gonna riff on the definition that we were given. So I really am interested in the material components of what is called intangible cultural heritage, the elemental stuff that comprises the practices, expressions, knowledge, and skills that communities, groups, and sometimes individuals recognize as part of their cultural heritage. As that substance erodes, what are the concomitant impacts upon identity, and what kind of world is left to be inherited? So it's also kind of thinking about the link between inheritance and heritage. So for instance, I was actually, Christine, when you were talking about tourism, a good way to kind of think about what I'm thinking about is, I've heard this phrase a lot in coalfield activism, which is, there can't be the mountain state without mountains. I'm reading a lot of glaciology right now. Glaciologists go to Iceland. Icelanders are worried about what will actually happen to their national identity. We no longer have any ice. And like Sheila Marconti says, like ice is part of the traditional ecological knowledge. It's not just epistemological, it's also ontological. It's part of their existence. So in short, I'm interested in the process from tangible to intangible, the melting ice flow, and further. So what happens when the intangible is forgotten or ignored? How that shifts gets storied, who gets to tell that story, and then how its losses might be remediated, at least remembered. I'm also an early modernist, so I think about how restoring past interactions with ice can productively intervene in the ecological present. So the book project I'm working on right now, it's under contract with Minnesota. It's called Cold Doings, early modern actions for our warmer world. And so what I've done is I've kind of split it up into kind of thick chapters. A chapter on like the stuff of cold, materiality of cold, a chapter on the Arctic is a populous, energetic, vibrant place. A chapter on Hamlet, which I'll talk about in a little bit. And then in between these chapters, I have these things called interludes, which are sort of like words and phrases from the early modern period that I think we can take with us and use really to create more equitable futures, to imagine and help create more equitable futures in the Arctic and in other icy places. So what I'm going to do for the rest of the presentation here is give you a few that at least I've been thinking about in terms of heritage. So they're either early modern terms, they're sort of like early modern adjacent terms. So the first one is one of my favorites, conglutinated. So this is John Taylor, who is also known as the water poet. Love this guy. He was a boatman. But notice like he doesn't just use the word freeze or frozen when he talks about the Thames being frozen over. So conglutinated like literally means like etymologically glued together. So it's not just things stop, right? It's things get pushed and they get stuck and compacted. To help me think about those sort of icy interrelations between humans and non-humans, my go-to text has always been the Historia de Gentibus Septentrionibus, which is also known as the History of the Northern Peoples, which was written and published by the Archbishop of Uppsala, Olaus Magnus, in 1555. So this is really kind of an encyclopedia, but it's this massive collection. It recounted in hundreds of chapters with accompanying woodcuts the extensive interlocking of Scandinavian cultures with their icy environments. So icy existence. In this chapter detailing the Glaciarum varietate, or the different kinds of ice, varietate, I guess. Magnus fuses snowscape and society. So there's a little house there at the bottom. An alpine house sits embedded in a glaciated rock, flanked by a frozen waterfall and riverine icebergs bearing barely humanoid faces. That's on the left. While a small fire burns inside the hut, its open-doored resemblance on the hillside above is striped with icicles. Each dwelling depicts the brutal northern winters as expected visitors. Northern architecture is but one brutal instance of, and this is a quote, the magnitude and fierceness of the cold in binding earth and water and other moist objects. So conglutinated. In Magnus's words. Magnus's neighbors farther south inherited his encyclopedic imagination, locating possibilities for civic entertainment, momentary feelings of concord in their seasonal ice boundedness. So Taylor did it in 1621, but the first frost fair, I love this image, was held on the solidified Thames in 1608. This is probably written by Thomas Dekker, Shakespeare's contemporary. Evident on the title page are cold dewies. Well, you can't really see it. Yeah, you can. Cold dewies in London. The things cold does and the delights ice allows. So we have bowling, beer drinking, backsliding. Yeah, I love the guy who's falling over the bottom left. I think this is sort of like pure pegophilia. So the pamphlet says a dialogue between a London citizen and an old man from the countryside who's come to walk, quote, upon a field of glass, as it were, a slippery world. A concord with ice is as brittle as it is. So that's the first term, conglutinated. Playing with cold also allows for cold plays. And so my next two terms are going to be related to the last chapter that I was working on called Hamlet on Ice. So in 2003, this is the ice globe. The ice globe, an Elizabethan replica built entirely from blocks of the Torn River's frozen banks. Right here, there's the Torn. It opened in Jukkasjärvi, Sweden, which is about 60 miles north of the Arctic Circle. Far there. The theater was coupled with the ice hotel, which you can see here. A glacial palace resurrected every winter at a cost of 7 million Swedish krona. That year, the National Theatre of Uve produced a shortened version of Hamlet in the Sami page. There it is. These pictures are really hard to find, which I can talk about later. You know it's Hamlet because they got the skulls in there. In the Sami language, a Finno-Ugric language spoken by 70 to 85,000 people, make up a minority population spanning northern Russia, Norway, Finland, Sweden. With temperatures hovering around -40 Celsius, which is about -40 Fahrenheit. The play's preoccupation with air that bites shrewdly, this is what Hamlet says, the air bites shrewdly, it is very cold. The play's preoccupation with air that bites shrewdly was surely felt by outdoor audiences. But so would have been the historical persecution of the Sami, people who were invested in the protection of their 40,000 square kilometer homeland, known as Sapmi, endangered by industrial development, and were fighting against the erasure of the traditional knowledge systems due to enforced acculturation, especially by the Swedish authorities. Here's just an example. This is actually ongoing outside of Gallup, Sweden. The Beowulf Mining Company, an English mining company, Sweden, is trying to extract iron ore from Sapmi. The Swedish government is sponsoring the licensing of this extraction process, which is sorry, this is actually multi-column, which is actually pretty common. Thank you. Sorry about that. This is a still from a documentary that was done in 2019. So right now it's still being held up. Greta Thunberg is involved, but this is a long history that dates back to the 17th century when these metals were first found in Sapmi. And this part of Sweden was actually known as the Swedish America for that reason, for its iron and silver. So dangers to Sami livelihood also took center stage, not just ice. The BST, the theater company's ongoing mission, according to artistic director Hoffmann Gunnarsson, is, quote, to give new expressions to traditional Sami culture, reflect on the realities of today's Sami society, make the existence of the Sami known to the outside world, and build bridges of understanding between cultures. Threats to their language are real. Instruction of North Sami and Ugric Sami has been encouraged in local communities, but these dialects are little known by foreigners and by Swedes alike. Temperatures in the Arctic are rising at rates double the global average, linking the Sami people's plight to the Inuit and others of the thaw in the north. And brings me to my second term, which actually is Jukkasjärvi. It's kind of like a Finnish translation of a Sami word, which means meeting place, or meeting place by the water. It's a place where things get enfolded and intersect, conglutinated. It's in accord with the BST's core values to ensure that histories of violence, let alone watch their culture become exoticized through high art. Indeed, their participation is meant to do the opposite, to enfold Hamlet in a centuries-long struggle for people to be remembered, their rights restored, and their wrongs addressed. So I stayed at the Ice Hotel in early 2020, a week before COVID, to pursue the leftover errors of the play and its performance. to wonder if the polar playhouse's physical materials help to pinpoint the globe's disappearing ice and snow in the indigenous peoples like the Sami most impacted by it. Globe being little g globe, the earth. I went to ask questions. How might exposing ourselves to the early modern cold of Hamlet, actually multi-species justice at the world's northern places of protest? It's kind of like the what is to be done question he was talking about. What is the fraught embrace of ice afford, and who are its allies? Or to think back to Decker, how does one safely navigate a sweltering world? When I sat down for fika, or coffee break, Swedish coffee break with Arne Berg, the Ice Globe's art director, who was a tribute. Just to be beyond eccentric. Its art director, on the day of my departure to ask him about designing the globe, he introduced me to the delicious Swedish phrase, my third and final term, on the bottom right, ice beaten, which actually just means the bite of ice. The spontaneous bite of ice that spurs artistic creativity. So when he was telling me about how he designed the globe and how he makes these rooms every year, for him it's not like I'm Michelangelo, like free form from the ice. He's basically like giving myself over this thing that then kind of shapes a co-shape whatever comes out of it. So by storing its lubricious force, Shakespeare and his contemporaries crucially reframe how we view the ice of the past as well as the present. But reading centuries-old texts will not save vanishing ice and snow, whether we're talking about big globes or small. But at a time in which popular climate studies obsess over ends, there's a bunch of books about ends of the world, ends of ice, the end of the planet headed for meltdown, or world after, or without ice. I think the perilous yet playful doings of early modern cold assist in counter-apocalyptic thinking. They ask us to identify what has been lost and view as a risk in defeating cold. They also urge us to imagine alternate futures focused not on inevitable collapse, but on ethical obligation and care. This is a picture of my wife herding reindeer, or maybe the reindeer is herding her. So about a half mile down the street from the Ice Hotel is the Niels Sami Sida, which is the Sami Cultural Center, because the Ice Hotel sits in the Sami land. And so you can go and you can basically, I would say the best example of Sami heritage on display here is the reindeer. It's basically like Donna Haraway's companion species. Sami is like totally interdependent on reindeer. So you can go and you can learn about that, you can learn about how they're cared for, and also about how climate change is making it harder for the reindeer and for the Sami. So for me, the question is not how to bring ice into matters of living tradition, but to become better at thinking collaboratively about intangible heritage or tangible heritage as intersections of nature and culture. Ice's existence. More than human expressions in meeting sites deserving of the right to be, as well as to thrive. So that really big question, that collaborative question, heritage is the intersection of nature and culture, care, all these things are really just kind of on my mind. Why I'm here, and why I will thank you in advance for the ensuing conversation. So thanks.
Thank you, Will. And thanks to all our talent.
Yeah.
Practice. Well, predictably, things have run pretty long, but we do have some time for questions and comments. I'll open the floor to your thoughts and your questions.
I have a question for Mike. First of all, thank you all. These were just amazing talks, really generative, but yeah, it's sort of forming itself as a question. So it's convoluted, I guess. I guess you could say, but just thinking about the kind of continued sort of extraction of Appalachia as a kind of commercial product. I'm just wondering that, you know, I mean, as you said, you know, you are trying to sort of retell or tell new stories about food traditions, but you must also have to simultaneously sort of think at the same time about how this might be appropriated, how it might be like, and that just must be very difficult, I would imagine. And I guess my question is, you know, is that as you're telling stories, do you have to make predictions about who else is going to take those stories and where they're going to get them, how they're going to.
Yeah, so I think that sort of like, that's a really good question because it is something that we think about all the time. But I think what we were sort of noticing is that this kind of appropriation sort of happens whether or not we wanted to, you know, whether or not we're involved. So I think where we saw the sort of window where we had to, you know, step in and do something was just like feeling like if we sort of took control and sort of tried to empower others to take control and sort of recapture some of the narratives and sort of redefine what things meant to them, you know, and again, sort of like being able to establish meaning in some way to these things to a point that people look at these traditions and say like, oh yeah, that's actually something valuable and I want to pass them on. Like that becomes valuable because there's a story attached to it, you know, it's just a commodity, you know, free of any value other than monetary value to someone who's gonna commodify it, like without that story attached to it, you know. And to us, it was like that story was so important because it's very easy. Like just to give a little bit of background, when I was like 16 years old, I really wanted to be a chef. I grew up in Kanawha County, and I grew up and I worked at this restaurant, sort of like fine dining kind of thing, but like there was never, this is like 2001, 2002, but there was never any sort of desire to attach like Appalachian or West Virginian to food at that point, because it was still at a point where it really like represented that kind of like shame of poverty, and like the connotations were all negative, you know. So when it becomes trendy, someone who doesn't live here can step in and capture what's trendy about it. And as soon as it's not trendy anymore, then you just like leave it behind, you know. It never doesn't matter because they're like not of this place. But if you are of this place, like you carry all of that baggage with you. So like you don't have a choice of like whether or not sort of I mean, I guess you can own it to like varying degrees, but like that story is yours, you know. So it was just sort of like it's kind of like if it's going to happen anyway, if that appropriation is going to happen, like we at least want to be in some sort of control over what the story is and sort of give people the tools to know that like there's a story that is potentially theirs, and maybe a complicated story, you know. Again, it's like I always think about the seeds. I think about the company that sells heritage salt in Kanawha Valley, you know, and it's like part of that heritage is the fact that that entire industry was built upon slave labor, you know, and it's like West Virginia has always sort of talked about it as like, well, we were anti-slavery because we were trying to be union and we didn't have slavery. But it's like that's sort of like the complicated narrative. It doesn't make the salt any less delicious. It doesn't, you know, like take away from the people that are still doing it, but it is part of like the complicated, the nuanced stories that we tell ourselves that we really want to move on. So yeah, I don't know if that answers your question, but I guess to sort of sum it up, like just yeah, I guess just there are certain things that are in our control and certain things that are out of our control. And I guess the storytelling part of it was just like we felt like we could kind of control things.
Yeah.
I was just thinking about, as you're talking just now and in your talk, like, I mean, it's something that people kind of make fun of now, like if you're looking for a recipe online, like you first have to like read like an entire like short novel about like, you know, whatever story there is behind this recipe. You kind of never really know how deep you're going to go into someone's life, but like thinking just about the recipe in all of that context in which it's presented as a kind of consensus defining form, even though like the actual recipe is just like follow these steps. And I was also thinking about what Mary Louise was saying about instruction and like heritage without instruction, or heritage that thinking about heritage beyond that, or what heritage looks like without that kind of guidance, without that kind of formality. And yeah, and it just that the recipe is as a kind of exemplary or form for you know, having that kind of unpredictability.
Yeah, for sure. And I always like, I don't know, I sometimes like the discourse on Twitter or whatever about this, like the recipe stories is really funny to watch, but I kind of love it, you know, because it's like recipes, seeds especially, you know, like the reason that this seed has been passed down for so long and it's still here after thousands of years and able to end up with us is because there was a story that went with it that made it valuable. You know, it wasn't passed on just because it's like pretty or it tastes good, which it does, but like the story goes with it. And one of the most beautiful moments that I ever remember was like when we were talking about seeds, we were talking to this old farmer who farms down in McDowell County, and he was talking about these beans he grew with his grandma. And, you know, it was just kind of like this afterthought, and like, well, I just really eat beans because that's what we've kind of always done. And then we were talking about storytelling, and he was just like, yeah, I've never really thought about it this way, but I guess I do think about it. Like the reason I grow these beans is because of her. Like it was his grandma, you know, it's like in the story of like my grandma, because every time I put that bean, that's her. She's still alive, you know, and that story is like goosebumps right now. But like the story goes with it, you know, and as long as that seed will be passed along, it's like that's like an opportunity for that story. So it's like, yeah, you've got story the seed swap, or like, you know, tell your recipe story in 10,000 words or whatever, or like your biscuits. That's what makes it valuable.
I was just gonna add that you know, that I love your, it seems to me that part of kind of what you're doing that is resistant to this sort of co-option is telling stories of food that point out that food is fraught, right? The food has uninhabitable histories as well as consumable histories.
Yeah. And I think that's, you know, like I will always be really frustrated with this idea of like how we have to talk about West Virginia to the outside world, you know, because we often sort of convince ourselves that we really need to tell everybody else that we're like not what we think we are. But you know, it's like back to that idea of heritage sort of being defined by whiteness. It's like people here sort of see the national media sort of saying like this is what Appalachian food is, and then we want to capitalize on it. We sort of feel the urge to conform to that stereotype, you know, to give people what we think they want, like based on that stereotype. And we also sort of fall into the trap of like taking that narrative to decide amongst ourselves, like who does and doesn't belong. So that's like, I don't know, I mean, that's just, it's been really fun sometimes to to have people, people that come to our farm from New York or California or wherever, and it's like sometimes it's like the very first time they've ever heard like these people live in West Virginia. Like you have vibrant Black communities in West Virginia. Like, oh yeah, let's take that one. Do a little digging.
So there's some, it also seems to be a theme about travel or very ways ended by asking what happens when heritage travels or goes viral. Kim, you're talking so much about movement, not a movement choice. But what has happened for the Appalachians who have been in Louisiana for so long?
300 years.
Yeah,
Well, more than 300 years.
That's a lot of generations.
And they haven't forgotten anything.
Yeah.
They have archives of their own material sitting there.
Yeah. Yeah. So when does one form connections to the land or the life? And when does that not happen?
Well, I mean, it's in their statement, they said, I mean, they've been there for 300 years and they still don't want to be.
Yeah. So it's still.
Right, I mean, so there's a lot, obviously, there's a lot that I didn't talk about. When they ended up in Louisiana, originally, it was Spanish territory at the time, and the Spanish government gave them 22,000 acres of land. Which I don't want to say that's generous, right? Because they're still not under it. That's not the land they want. But considering what we know about dispossession and colonialism, it's not insignificant. But then the US did not honor that when it became American, right? So, and they were pursued by the Klan until as recently as the 1950s, if not after, and they're still being harassed and now having other people trying to appropriate their identity because they think they can profit off of it. That, by the way, I put that slide up with their Facebook page and their website because there is another group that you might find that is not them. So Bennett is the name that you want. And that picture that I showed will also be up there. I also brought a copy of that picture printed out for if there's a display we're doing, as well as their words. But yeah, that they've moved and they don't want to be moved to where they are, right? They're still trying to go back. They were also offered some options in Florida, but the most tangible of those options would have involved them being subsumed by another tribe and relinquishing their name and identity as Appalachia, in which case, what's the point, right? So they have been given options, but none of them were, they were all equally unpalatable. So yeah, here we are.
Let me ask you about this other unexpected layer of dispossession in that their name has effectively been taken away. We do not have any association when we think of Appalachia. We do not have any association.
I know.
Have any sense that there is a tribe existing today. Was completely mistaken. The term completely mistaken to different media. What do they think? And now the promise to come back to Florida is tied up with another erasure of their identity. It's kind of stunning.
I haven't asked them, what do you think about the fact your name is on these mountains? I mean, I assume that they think it's absurd and I mean, I don't want to put adjectives into other people's mouths. I still try to remove as many adjectives as possible from my own writing where they're proliferating. But they seem like a good idea when I write them down at first, and not when I read it out loud. Yeah, I don't know, and I don't have an answer to that question. I will ask. At least someone in the group was planning on watching tonight, so I don't know if they're still watching. I will ask them that, but as a kind of an oblique response to that question, I'll say that was part of why I had this real dilemma where I was like, I just spent years, I just spent almost a decade of my life finding and telling this story. And I feel like I should share it with the people whose name sparked this history, but I also am afraid of just being an axe, right? Because it really has nothing to do with them. It has to do with everything but them. It has to do with the things that were said about them that were not true. But then ultimately I said, you know, those things that were said about them, even though it, you know, gold was found in Georgia eventually, but that was much later, you know, 1800s. It was never found by the people who were killing and dying looking for it for 200 years, but that didn't stop them from killing and dying looking for it. So I said, ultimately, in some small way, this may help them solidify their case, further document their case. So I'm going to risk just being some jerk at a college and ask them if they you know want to know more about it. And I guess that they approve of my telling of the story because we're still speaking, right? And they wrote something for this tonight. So yeah, I don't know. It didn't occur to me to ask that question because it almost seemed like, I mean, I don't know, because I just assumed that it's absurd to them, right? But I'll ask them. Or hi, if you're listening still, let's follow up later.
They're up on the chat.
Oh, hi. Hi, everyone. Sorry, I know the masks don't help. I kept it off to talk earlier. Thank you for being with us.
Thank you.
Hi. Oh, thank you. And so I don't know. So the question that was asked, and I will keep my mask off again to repeat it, was what do you think about this fact that your name was taken and now it's, you know, it's in West Virginia and it has nothing to do with you and nobody here knows that it is you. It might not be an appropriate question for a chat on Zoom, but if not, we can talk later. I'll call Renee.
Well, we might have to return to the conversation. I mean, yeah, we have more time with each other. People left on the chat. We're documenting all this, and there'll be some public-facing components of what comes out of this one.
So the name use is taken out of context. Yeah, right. Yeah, that's what that map that I'm, you know. Yeah, I'm a little obsessed with, but you know, for obvious reasons, I think. Yeah, definitely taken out of context.
Yeah, if you haven't picked up Kim's book yet, it's a revelation.
I don't want to advertise for the evil empire, but they have just, after it's been out for a year, they just discounted it slightly on Amazon. So, it's yeah.
All right. This is so weird.
Thank you. I will talk to you all soon. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks everybody for joining.
Yeah, so we should probably draw to a close. We at least have more time with each other to draw out some of the other connections, to talk about the relationship between tangible and intangible. To talk about that through line of language. With language and food, there's a newly rediscovered language. There's Sami also, which is having another renaissance, and there was more tracks theorizing about intangible culture. So all of these things await us. But thanks very much again to our panelists.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.